You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
In 1944, a doctor covered a deceased patient's body with a sheet and then wheeled their stretcher out into the hallway. The morgue at the Oregon State Hospital was already full, so the doctor planned to put this body in the chapel. But when he pushed open the chapel doors, there were already so many stretchers with dead patients with sheets on them inside that there was no room for this patient. The doctor closed the chapel's heavy wooden doors and just stood there, his mind racing. More than 400 patients had fallen violently ill in the past 12 hours, and dozens had died. The doctor had no idea what the cause was, and if he couldn't figure it out, he knew more bodies would be joining the ones already lining the inside of the chapel. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please invite the follow button on an African safari, but before you go, make sure you sneak 27 raw steaks into their backpack. This week's story is called Blood Feast. It was late in the afternoon on November 18th, 1942. A cook named Mickey McKillop opened the lid of a giant metal vat, then asked his volunteer sous chef, 27-year-old George Nosen, to carry it over to an industrial oven. Mickey and George were starting to prepare dinner for almost 500 patients across 5 wards at the Oregon State Hospital, a public mental facility for psychiatric patients. Tonight's menu was scrambled egg yolks and toast, and Mickey, along with his boss, Mary O'Hare, were the only 2 cooks on duty. The hospital had been understaffed for a year now, ever since the United States entered World War II. Many members of the nursing staff had left to volunteer for the war effort. During the day, there was about 1 attendant for every 16 patients, but at night, that number swelled to 1 attendant for every 150 patients. Mickey and Mary were so desperate for help in the kitchen that they had started asking trustworthy patients to help them prep for each meal. And one of those trustworthy patients was Mickey's volunteer sous chef, George Nosen. George placed a frozen 16-pound canister of eggs onto the countertop beside the oven. Mickey liked George, and he felt a little sorry for him too. George's parents had originally brought him to the hospital for help with his epilepsy, which is a disorder of the brain characterized by repeated seizures. At this time, people were just beginning to understand how epilepsy actually worked. George's parents most likely saw it as a mental condition, which is why they brought him to the state hospital. They probably didn't think he was crazy, they just wanted help with getting his seizures under control. But during George's initial evaluation, the staff psychologist would diagnose George with paranoid schizophrenia, and then they had George involuntarily committed for life. Mickey didn't understand how that was possible. He'd never seen George hallucinate or get aggressive like the other patients with schizophrenia, but there was nothing he could do about it. And if he was being honest with himself, he was glad to have someone so mild-mannered and easygoing to help him in the kitchen. Mickey yanked the lid off the canister that George had just set down, revealing hundreds of thawing egg yolks. These days, a lot of the hospital's food supply came from federal surplus deliveries, since the government was rationing food to help the war effort. The egg whites were used in food that was sent overseas, and hospitals stateside got the leftover yolks. It was time to start cooking, so Mickey dumped out the canister into the metal vat. He repeated the process 2 more times until the stovetop was crowded with thawing eggs. He handed George a cup and asked for water, and then he lit the stovetop so the eggs would warm faster. He let George dump the water into the vat, then the 2 of them started slicing bread loaves. Once they were done, Mickey turned on the oven and laid all the bread slices across the metal grates to be toasted. Then he turned his attention back to the eggs. They were finally thawed, so Mickey asked George to grab some powdered milk. It was the only thing that made the egg yolks creamy enough to scramble. As Mickey stirred the eggs, he sent George to fetch something else, postum powder, a caffeine-free coffee substitute they'd been getting from the government over the past year. Mickey even let George mix the drink himself. He'd never let a patient touch an actual dinner item before, so Mickey took a quick sip just to be safe. The postum tasted like chalk, which meant it was made correctly. He clapped George on the back and told him he'd done a great job. But that momentary taste test distracted Mickey just long enough for the eggs to start burning. Mickey cussed as he turned off the stovetop, wondering how to fix this. He threw in a palmful of salt and then gave the eggs a stir, and then they looked good as new. When dinner was finally done, Mickey and George portioned the eggs and toast into buffet dishes and then loaded them onto a big cart for delivery at each of the 5 dining halls spread across the hospital's wards. By the time they got to Ward 5, hungry patients lined the hallway outside the cafeteria, urging Mickey and George to please hurry up. Finally, a bell rang and the lines began to move. From behind the buffet table, Mickey watched as the patients ladled scrambled eggs onto their plates. He helped serve them each a piece of toast, and then sent the patients to sit at the long metal tables that ran the length of the dining hall. And as the patients all dug into their food, Mickey heard someone call out that the eggs were too salty. Mickey winced and felt bad because he knew he very well could have oversalted them. And while Mickey was worrying about the eggs, another patient in the room took a long swig of postum and then started to choke. One of the nurses walked over to pat the patient on the back, but instead of swallowing, the patient keeled over and threw up on the nurse's shoes. The nurse shrieked, and Mickey looked over and saw a red streak on the ground. It took him a second to realize that it wasn't vomit, it was blood. The patient then fell backwards onto the floor, and those around him began to scream. The nurse bent over and tried to steady the man, who was now having a seizure on the floor. Mickey ran over to help her, but before he could make it, another patient sent a spray of red blood shooting across the table. Mickey shouted for everyone to stop eating. But his warning came too late. More patients began throwing up blood. Others collapsed onto the floor, writhing in pain. Mickey didn't know what to do, so he just tried to catch patients as they fell. One nurse ran into the hallway and sounded an alarm. Mickey stooped over a patient who was clawing at his own face, saying he couldn't feel it. His lips were swollen and blue. He tried to help the man return to his seat, but the man collapsed back down to the floor and started saying that his legs were paralyzed. Mickey was totally horrified and his hands trembled with fear, and he had no idea what could cause this terrible reaction people were having. Dr. William Lidbeck had just finished dinner when his phone rang at his home on the hospital grounds. When he picked it up, all he heard on the other end was screaming and shouting. Then a panic-stricken nurse got on the line and begged him to run up to the hospital. Patients across 4 of the 5 wards were collapsing, they were vomiting blood, and now losing feeling in their faces and limbs. Dr. Lidbeck dropped his fork, ran out his front door, and tore across the lawn, heading for the side entrance of the main hospital building, 100 yards from his cottage. With every step, the screaming he could hear grew louder. It sounded like every patient inside of the building was in agony. Moments later, the doctor flung the door open and stepped into the hallway, and the scene that greeted him was horrible. The hallway was full of patients sitting on the floor with their backs up against the wall, coughing blood into their laps. One man had been strapped to a gurney in the hallway, spasming wildly, blood running down the front of his shirt. His entire mouth was swollen and drool collected at the side of his lips. A nurse ran into the hallway and beckoned Dr. Lidbeck to come quickly. He followed her through a doorway into the cafeteria, where he saw dozens of patients writhing on the floor. The nurse that Dr. Lidbeck had followed dashed ahead of him. She knelt down beside one of the patients and started spoon-feeding him baking soda. Dr. Lidbeck caught up to her and asked what was going on. She admitted that the nursing staff had no idea what had caused this outbreak, but it had started right after the patients had begun their dinner. She didn't know how to reverse it, but she was just hoping that baking soda would help alleviate their stomach pain. The entire staff was running around in complete panic, trying to manage symptoms. Dr. Lidbeck took a deep breath and tried to push down his rising fear. He'd never dealt with sudden illness on such a massive scale, but he knew that he couldn't do anything without the proper equipment. He had to get his medicine bag from his office on the second floor. He instructed the nurse to keep working, then ran out of the cafeteria and down the hallway. He turned the corner into the third ward, where the scene was exactly the same. It was full of patients covered in their own blood, writhing on the floor. Dr. Lidbeck had always prided himself on having a steely stomach, but this felt unbearable to watch. He rushed through the hallway, stepping over sick patients as he went, and ran up the stairs to the second floor. But as he left the stairwell, he stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in this ward was completely different. The hallway was empty. If it weren't for the screams echoing from downstairs, it would almost feel peaceful. As he walked past open doors, he saw all the patients tucked in their beds. They looked scared, but seemed to be otherwise fine. Dr. Lidbeck was confused. How was this ward so calm when the rest were full of chaos and vomiting patients? A door opened at the end of the hallway, and the ward's head nurse, Allie Wassel, stepped out and walked toward him. Dr. Lidbeck thought she looked really pale. The nurse seemed very relieved to see Lidbeck, and she would tell him that she thought there had to be something wrong with the eggs from dinner. She said she had taken one bite and they had tasted so spoiled that she ordered all her patients not to eat them, and so her patients were fine, but she had been throwing up ever since. A chill ran through Dr. Lidbeck. He didn't know yet what was causing his patients to vomit blood, but now he knew it very likely had to be related to the eggs. It was the only thing all the patients had eaten that night. But it couldn't just be a case of spoiled food. An egg would have to be so rotten to cause this that it never would have been served in the first place. It would have been obviously bad. Then a realization dawned on him. If the eggs themselves were fine, it meant that something else had been put in the eggs that night. He was glad that Nurse Wassel had not eaten more of them. Dr. Lidbeck told the head nurse that if she started feeling worse, to please come find him right away, and then the doctor ran back downstairs to tend to the sick patients. As Dr. Lidbeck went down a hallway, he passed by the hospital morgue. A nurse was wheeling a covered stretcher inside. One of the patients had died. Dr. Lidbeck's blood ran cold, but he didn't have time to stop and mourn. There were hundreds of other patients still waiting for treatment, and so he didn't have a moment to lose. About 16 hours later, in the late morning of November 19th, Oregon Governor Charles Sprague raced along the highway in his car. An hour earlier, Sprague had heard about last night's outbreak at the state hospital. Now he was on the way to the state capitol, where an emergency State Board of Control meeting would soon commence. From the moment the United States had entered the war, Sprague feared a morning like this. He was worried that the outbreak at the hospital was caused by sabotage, that the country's enemies had deliberately tampered with these eggs. He knew that the Oregon State Hospital received food rations from the government. The frozen eggs had been part of a shipment to the hospital 6 months ago. But those eggs had been separated from a much larger batch. It was entirely possible that someone had poisoned that larger supply, which was then sent around to various institutions throughout the country. Sprague worried that if someone had tampered with the egg supply, anywhere that had received eggs from that batch would suffer a similar attack. Sprague shuddered at the thought of a spy for the Axis powers poisoning innocent Americans. The Food and Drug Administration had already ordered all institutions that received these eggs to immediately stop using them. Sprague's driver stopped the car outside the front steps of the Capitol building. Once Sprague got out, he was greeted by an aide who walked with him up the stairs. The aide had just received word from the hospital. As of 10:30 that morning, 47 patients had died, and their bodies were still lining the hospital hallways, and another 350 patients were violently ill. As governor, Sprague needed to make sure that investigators had the resources necessary to investigate the egg tampering and find out who was behind it. He told the aide that he'd be a few minutes late to the meeting, then headed for his office to call the chief of police in Salem, Oregon, where the state hospital was located. Later that afternoon, the superintendent of the hospital, Dr. John Evans, stood in front of a cage of rats in a laboratory. He was holding a plateful of scrambled eggs. Earlier that morning, a coroner had requested permission to perform autopsies on the patients who had died. Dr. Evans allowed him to take 6 of the dead, hoping the autopsy results could tell him what had happened. A few hours after the coroner had taken the bodies, Dr. Evans received a toxicology report that confirmed his worst fear. The patients had been poisoned. However, nobody knew yet what they were poisoned with or how. The coroner was still running tests. But that was why Dr. Evans was now holding a plateful of the contaminated scrambled eggs that had been served the night before. He was running his own experiment. On a neighboring table, there was another cage of rats and another plate of eggs. But these eggs came straight from one of the egg yolk canisters still in the freezer. A lab technician had thawed them out that morning. They reasoned that if only the first cage of rats died, that meant the poison had been added into the eggs at the hospital. But if both cages of rats died, it meant the eggs themselves had been poisoned before they were shipped to the hospital, and tens of thousands of people could be in danger. Dr. Evans placed each plate of eggs into their respective cages and then waited for the rats to eat. A moment later, the rats in the first cage began to shake violently and foam at the mouth. They squealed in pain, and within minutes, all of them were dead. Dr. Evans looked over at the other cage and saw those rats were just fine. The experiment had worked. It confirmed this wasn't a case of mass contamination or widespread enemy conspiracy. The eggs were clearly just fine when they arrived at the hospital before something or someone poisoned them. But it also meant there could be a mass murderer inside the hospital who was the one who added the poison. Enraged and disgusted, Dr. Evans called the police. 3 days later, on November 22nd, head nurse Allie Wassel, who had ordered her patients not to eat the eggs, sat in Dr. Lidbeck's office speaking to a barrel-chested detective. The investigators had been interviewing every patient and member of staff for the past 2 days, trying to determine who poisoned the eggs. Further testing had revealed that the poison was sodium fluoride, better known as cockroach poison. Detectives had even found some in a basement storeroom, but what they didn't know was how it had gotten into the eggs or who had done it. Allie wanted to help, but she told the detective that she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Until that horrible dinner, she'd been on duty, taking care of patients. She watched the detective as he scribbled something down on a notepad, and she started to feel nervous. Allie assured the detective that the other nurses would confirm her story, too. The detective wrote a few more things down and then looked up at Allie and thanked her for her time and told her she was free to go. Allie breathed a sigh of relief and stood up to leave. As she reached the door, the detective told an officer standing outside to bring in the next person to be interviewed, assistant cook Mickey McKillop. Allie passed Mickey as she was walking down the hallway. He was waiting in a chair outside the office, bouncing his leg up and down. Allie couldn't help but think that he looked anxious, or like a man who was hiding something. By late that same evening, Mickey McKillop had been in Dr. Lidbeck's office for hours. The detective had asked him the same few questions over and over, pressing him about the way the kitchens were run. Mickey thought he'd kept his story straight, but he'd told it so many times now that it was hard to be sure, and he knew he was likely starting to confuse the details. All Mickey wanted to do was sleep. He had a migraine that was making it hard to focus, but every time he closed his eyes, the detective would shake him awake. And so Mickey was feeling like he would do just about anything to make this interview end. It was obvious the police were suspicious of him, and Mickey knew they would not give up until he, Mickey, told the police what they needed to know. So Mickey decided it was time to come clean. Mickey sat up in the stiff wooden chair, and while avoiding eye contact with the detective, Mickey would admit that he did know more than he had told them. Mickey said that he could tell them exactly who had poisoned the eggs. In fact, he had watched it happen, and worst of all, he had not done a thing to stop it. An hour later, Mickey and his boss, Mary O'Hare, were being led from the Oregon State Hospital in handcuffs. A police officer read the charges. Mickey was charged with manslaughter, Mary was charged with accessory after the fact. Then the officer loaded them into a police van. Mickey took one last look at the hospital and caught a glimpse of a few patients staring out the windows, terrified looks on their faces. One of the faces he recognized was George Nosen, the psychiatric patient who volunteered in the kitchen. Mickey shook his head. He knew that what he had just told the detectives would change George's life forever. When Mickey the cook finally told the truth to detectives, he began by telling them about the terrible evening the sickness broke out. While the nursing staff was running around treating all these patients who were vomiting up blood, Mickey saw George Nosen cowering in the hallway, and suddenly Mickey had a terrible thought. He grabbed George and asked him to retrace his steps from that afternoon. Mickey and George mimed preparing the eggs, getting the frozen yolks, lighting the stove, getting some water to help warm them. Then Mickey followed George down the kitchen steps in search of the powdered milk that made the eggs creamy. At the bottom of the steps, there were 2 storeroom doors. Instinctively, Mickey leaned toward the storeroom on the left, which held dry goods, but George led him to the storeroom on the right, which held fruits and vegetables. Mickey felt an icy chill run through him. He watched George turn the key and open the right door. George pointed to a large, unmarked tin canister sitting on the ground inside. It was open and filled with white powder. A scoop was sticking out of the powder like it had just been used. Mickey's stomach dropped, but he tried to look unbothered. He thanked George and sent him to his room. Then he ran back upstairs and grabbed his boss, Mary, and showed her the canister George had just pointed out. Mary went white as a sheet. It was against the rules for Mickey to have given keys to a patient. Mary told Mickey that she did understand why he'd done it. They were so understaffed, he'd been desperate for help. But if anyone found out, they were both done for, and so they agreed to keep it a secret. Mary had kept her promise and said nothing, but Mickey eventually broke and told the story to the detective in Dr. Lidbeck's office. Once the detective got Mickey's confession, they knew who had poisoned the eggs at the Oregon State Hospital and how they had done it. That fateful night, George had taken the keys to the storeroom and headed down to the basement. But he went into the wrong storeroom. He went into the right door, and he brought back a heaping scoop of white powder that he believed was powdered milk, but it wasn't. He then poured that white powder into a vat of scrambled eggs, and in doing so, George had accidentally poisoned his fellow patients with sodium fluoride, aka cockroach poison. To this day, nobody knows why the poison was kept in that storeroom with the fruits and vegetables. In adults, a lethal dosage of sodium fluoride is just 5 to 10 grams, which is a bit more than what you'd find in a sugar packet. Well, George had accidentally spiked the eggs with 5 pounds of poison. In the end, the charges against Mickey the cook and his boss Mary were dismissed. The hospital was held liable since the real culprit was gross understaffing. The only person who suffered any real consequences for the mistake was George, who was unable to leave Oregon State Hospital for another 41 years. George was never the same after that night. He couldn't forgive himself for what he'd done, even if it was just a tragic mistake. The patients who remembered the outbreak bullied him relentlessly for decades, and after a while, George started fighting back. He got into physical brawls on multiple occasions, and then in 1983, he got into a big altercation with an older inmate, and during it, George was severely injured and died as a result.
February 28, 1976, Daniel Halseth was born in a small town in Oregon called Estacada, which is located about 30 miles southeast of Portland. Daniel's family owned a farm, and so from a young age, Daniel became accustomed to getting up super early and helping out with daily chores. This childhood experience on the farm instilled in Daniel a strong work ethic, and it also taught Daniel to really appreciate family, because the family he had grown up in spent all their time together, and they all struggled and worked together every day to make ends meet. In high school, Daniel really began to blossom. He had this wonderful energy and huge radiant smile that drew people to him, and he was just one of those people that was just naturally gifted at everything he did, and it seemed totally effortless. During his high school years, he picked up playing the piano as well as the drums, and his classmates affectionately nicknamed him Drummer Dan. Daniel was also amazing with anything to do with computers or technology, and Daniel was just very handsome and very athletic athletic and fit, and so he was really the guy that everybody wanted to be. But despite having all of these things going for him, Daniel was dealt a major blow in 1994 when he was in his junior year of high school. That year, his father, who he was quite close with, died unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. This was a crushing blow for a young man that still very much leaned on his father for guidance and support. But Daniel, like the rest of his family, found a way to just keep on going despite this immense heartbreak. In 1995, so a year after his father's death, Daniel would graduate high school and he would head to Salem, Oregon, where he would go to school and earn his bachelor's degree in music, and then he would stick around in Salem at another university and he would earn his master's in business. And it was during those years that he was in Salem that Daniel would meet a young woman named Elizabeth Schwarak, who had grown up in Salem. She, like Daniel, was incredibly hardworking and was just naturally good at everything she tried. She was also a model, and so when she and Daniel began dating, they genuinely looked like this beautiful Hollywood couple. In 2001, which was shortly after Daniel had earned his master's degree, he and Elizabeth got married. 5 years later, the couple, who now were the proud parents of 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy, they moved to Las Vegas because Daniel had found work there. Daniel had founded this computer IT company because he was so skilled with computers, and it was really starting to thrive, and many of his clients were in or around Las Vegas. But just a few years after getting settled in Las Vegas, it would be Elizabeth's career ambitions that would take center stage in the family. Elizabeth had always wanted to get into politics, and in 2010, she decided she would run for a state Senate seat in Nevada. But in order to do that, she would need to campaign really aggressively, which would mean she'd be gone a lot of the time. And so Daniel, who was working full-time with this computer company, he would need to keep doing that because that paid the bills, but he would also have to become the primary parent for their 3 children. And so when she approached Daniel and said, I really want to do this, but it requires a lot out of you. Are you willing to do this? Daniel was completely supportive and actually really excited at the idea. He had no problems whatsoever. And so very soon, Elizabeth would be out on the road campaigning and trying to win the state Senate seat, and Daniel would be home goofing around with the kids and taking them hiking and going to playgrounds and parks. And then after he would put the kids to bed at night, he would stay up super late and run his computer business out of their dining room. And all this additional hard work and sacrifice that Daniel was making for his wife paid off when later that year, on November 2nd, Elizabeth, who had run this incredible campaign that was built on family values and wholesomeness and morality, she would win the state Senate seat, which shocked the state of Nevada. And even more impressive, she would become the youngest woman to ever be elected to Nevada legislature at just 27 years old. So it was clear to everyone in Nevada and also outside of Nevada that Elizabeth was destined for greatness. She was going to be the next big political superstar. And anyone who was close to the Halseth family knew Daniel was her #1 cheerleader. He was so proud of her. But soon, the Halseth's perfect life would come crumbling down. It was not long after Elizabeth had won her election that Daniel began to notice she was becoming suspiciously close with another man named Tiger Helgelian, who was a former golf pro and fellow rising political star. After noticing his wife constantly texting with Tiger, Daniel would actually reach out to Tiger directly and beg him to stop messaging his wife and to just leave his family alone. But the texting and the calling and the interactions between those two would not stop. And then finally, in October of 2011, so less than a year into Elizabeth's first term as a state senator, Daniel would find out that his wife and Tiger had been away together alone on this long extended work trip. And so Daniel realized that almost certainly his wife was having an affair. And so when his wife came home from this trip and she was unpacking in their bedroom, Daniel walked into the room and he accused her of being unfaithful. And the argument that ensued got very heated, but it did not become physically violent. Basically, Daniel just screamed and yelled at Elizabeth, swearing at her and kind of losing his temper completely. But at some point, Elizabeth just said, "Daniel, stop." and Daniel would actually stop. And in fact, both Elizabeth and Daniel, when they were called this night, would say as soon as she said stop, Daniel stopped yelling and he left the room. Over the next couple of days, Daniel and Elizabeth would go to therapy sessions at their church, indicating that they both were making a concerted effort to try to salvage their marriage. But on October 21st, 5 days after this big blow-up fight about the affair, Elizabeth would go to police and she would claim Daniel had touched her inappropriately during the fight they had over the affair. And so Daniel, much to his shock, was arrested and charged with something called open and gross lewdness, which is effectively unwanted touching of another person. This accusation is quite common, especially amongst people at bars who are drinking. There's lots of unwanted touching that can happen there. But interestingly, this particular charge is cited as being one of the more frequently falsely accused offenses because the police do not require any physical proof to actually arrest someone. Basically, people are, in theory, able to get other people arrested simply by claiming they inappropriately touched them, even if there is not a shred of proof. It's basically one person's word against the other. After being found guilty of open and gross lewdness, Daniel was sentenced to 6 months of probation, anger management, and he had to register as a sex offender. Shortly after he was found guilty, Daniel filed for divorce. Their divorce, which was heavily centered on who gets custody of their 3 kids, was very contentious, it was very bitter, and it was very public. Because Elizabeth was a state senator, she was in the public eye, and because her campaign that she had run on to get elected was built entirely on wholesomeness and family values and having good moral character, that when rumors started to fly that she had had this affair with Tiger Helgelien and that had blown up her family and her husband is being charged with open and gross lewdness, it was just so salacious that despite her denying that she ever had this affair and acting like she was in the right, she was still forced to resign from her state Senate seat in February of 2012. The divorce would finalize later that year, and most likely because of Daniel's new sex offender status from the open and gross lewdness charge, he was denied custody of the 3 children, despite the fact that for the last several years, he had been the everyday primary parent. So Elizabeth, she gets custody of all 3 kids, and she promptly leaves Nevada to go to Alaska with her 3 kids to live with Tiger Helgelien, the man she denied having an affair with. And shortly after arriving in Alaska, she married Tiger Helgelien. Daniel was heartbroken. It was like his life had blown up in a matter of seconds. But most devastating of all was that his kids, who he called his 3 little angels, were now so far away from him, he couldn't even see them if he wanted to. But just like he had done back in 1994 when his father passed away, Daniel just found a way to keep on going despite this horrible pain he was feeling. Over the next few years, Daniel would pour himself into his computer business and really make that his full-time effort, and he would make every effort to see his children any chance he got. But because his relationship with his ex-wife Elizabeth was not good, it was really difficult to see his kids. Eventually, Daniel would meet another woman named Bogdana, and they would actually get married. And when that happened, it seemed like in the eyes of Daniel's family, he was starting to kind of finally get his life back on track. Around this time, Daniel began sharing more and more of his life on his social media channels. And every post he made, and he made lots of them nearly every day, were so overwhelmingly positive and optimistic, and it really showcased his wonderful personality that was all about lifting up your fellow person and just being a good human being. And he also posted loads of videos of him goofing around with his 3 kids because he adored his kids. They were the most important thing to him by far. But despite having this very cheerful outward presence on social media, privately, Daniel was dealt yet another very difficult blow in 2019 when his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of the second divorce remained positive and very optimistic for the most part, but anytime you saw an image of Daniel actually facing the camera, you could just see a distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as quickly as it seemed like once again Daniel's life was just going gonna crumble, something truly amazing happened for Daniel. Daniel's first ex-wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 kids decided to leave Alaska and come back to Nevada and resettle in Las Vegas. This was not because Elizabeth wanted to rekindle with Daniel. It was just because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to come back. And as soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited and so happy. In fact, by late 2020, Daniel's youngest daughter, Sierra, who was 16, she had basically just moved in with Daniel, even though legally speaking, she was not supposed to be doing that. And her mom, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But regardless, that was just how it was. She was living with Daniel. In August of that year, so around the time that Sierra had basically moved back in with Daniel, Daniel decided to take his ex-wife, Elizabeth, back to court to see if he could get custody of Sierra, because Sierra was the only minor of their 3 children. She was still 16, and at that point, Sierra was already living with him. During the recorded video sessions between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel would tell the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not good for his children, and certainly not good for Sierra. Daniel would explain to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues, and what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved back in with him. Daniel also presented to the judge a letter that he said Sierra wrote that basically backed up the idea that she is better off living with her father. Elizabeth would generally respond to all of these things that Daniel was saying by saying Daniel was a liar and that he was not fit to be a parent, and that letter that he claims Sierra wrote doesn't sound like her, insinuating that, the letter was forged. The judge, who at regular intervals would get very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally would just say, look, you got all sorts of issues between the 2 of you, and it's creating a horrible environment for your kids. And if you don't find a way to come to some sort of compromise, the people that are going to suffer are your kids, specifically Sierra. Finally, in early 2021, when Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to terms, the judge just ordered that Daniel return Sierra to her mother's residence because, legally speaking, Sierra was supposed to be in her mother's care. And so begrudgingly, Daniel would take Sierra and he would bring her back to her mother's house and he would say, okay, go see your mother, and then he would drive off. But later that night, Sierra would sneak out of her mother's house and just run back to be with her dad. Needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that turn of events. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months, with Sierra opting to still remain at her father's place despite the court order, despite her mother pleading with her to come home. And then in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was shared between Daniel and his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just hadn't gotten around to relinquishing control to one or the other. And so these particular withdrawals were kind of uncharacteristic for Daniel or for Bogdana, and so they were flagged as potentially fraudulent, and so the bank sent notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana saying as much. And so Bogdana, she gets the messages that there's been these potentially fraudulent charges. She knows it wasn't her, and so she calls Daniel, but Daniel doesn't pick up, and so she texts Daniel. But again, silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little bit odd, Bogdana reached out to Daniel's mother, Christine, knowing that Daniel and his mom spoke nearly every day. And so she filled the mother in about what was going on. And after getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine would try calling and texting Daniel, but still got nothing. And so she reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. And so she calls Sierra. Sierra doesn't pick up. She texts Sierra asking to speak to Daniel, and Sierra doesn't get back right away, but eventually she responds to Christine, and the response just said, his phone has been acting up, but he's okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night. No worries. Now, Christine was relieved to read that her son and her granddaughter were just fine, but at the same time, there was just something odd about the fact that she could not get in touch with her son, and that Sierra was kind of acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her, and then sending a message that didn't quite sound like her. But either way, Christine just let it go and figured she would be in touch with her son over the next 24 hours. But the next day, by 10 a.m., when Christine and Bogdana had not heard or seen Daniel, Christine again reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra. She called her, but she didn't pick up. And so she texted Sierra, this time demanding that she put her father on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message that said something to the effect of, my dad's in the shower, so he can't talk right now. Christine, at this point, it was like her radar was up and she knew there was a real problem. She didn't know what it was, but there was a problem and someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure he and Sierra were okay. And so Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman, who was Daniel's landlord and a close friend of Daniel. And she asked Peggy, would you mind going and doing a welfare check at Daniel's house? And Peggy would say, of course, no problem, but I won't be able to get over there for at least several hours. So Christine said, no problem. But as soon as she hung up, Christine just was so anxious, waiting to find out what was going on with her son, that at 1:46 p.m., when still Peggy was out running errands and had not done the welfare check yet, Christine just called the police and asked them to do a welfare check.
Yeah, hi, I need a welfare check. I don't know
on who are we doing a welfare check?
For my son. He's been missing for 2 days. His work's called. His family's called, I've called, his ex-wife's called, and there's nobody answering the phone and there's nothing. Nobody can get a hold of him, and then his work called and they can't get a hold of him, and it's really, he just doesn't act like this.
But as it would happen, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's residence ahead of the police. And so when they got there, they hopped out of their car, they walked up to the front door, and as they're knocking on the front door, they look over into the driveway and they see Daniel's car, which was a blue Nissan Altima, is not there. And so they're knocking, they're seeing the car's not there, it's totally silent in the house. And so Peggy, she reaches down and she tries the doorknob and she finds it's unlocked. And so she twists the knob, she opens the door, and she and her friend step inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend would come running out of the house, and Peggy would call 911 because the police weren't there yet, and she would frantically try to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen. 24 hours earlier, a man and a woman were spotted on surveillance camera withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. Those were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent and tipped Bogdana off that something could be wrong here. After those withdrawals, the man and the woman were spotted again on camera going into a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco, and inside they would purchase a few items using Daniel's debit card, and then they would leave and they would head to a Las Vegas Home Depot, where once again they'd be caught on camera purchasing a few items using Daniel's debit card. After these purchases, the man and the woman would make their way to Daniel's residence, where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima car was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence and then quickly turned around and ran out and called 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's residence on April 9th, and they pulled up and they saw Peggy Newman and her friend totally ashen-faced and pacing on the sidewalk, the police would get out, they would talk to those two, they would go inside of Daniel's residence, and they would see the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had also seen. But the police could not make sense of what they were seeing. It really just did not add up. Then, 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to find the man and the woman that were seen on camera on April 8th using Daniel's debit card and going to the Winco and the Home Depot. The police, they just happened to find these people on a bus in Salt Lake City. And after going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police would discover a video that these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days that explained what was inside of Daniel's house.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Day 3 after murdering somebody.
Whoa! Don't put that on the camera.
It was worth it.
The young man and the young woman you just saw joking on camera about murdering someone were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of all those different ATMs, they had gone to the Winco and purchased disposable gloves and bleach and drop cloths, and they had gone to the Home Depot and purchased a circular saw and saw blades and lighter fluid. And then they headed for Daniel's house. It's not been made public what actually occurred inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few assumptions. Daniel adored his children. There was no act there. He truly loved his children. And so it would never cross his mind that one of his children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. And so when Sierra and Aaron went inside of Daniel's house, it would have been extremely easy to sneak up on Daniel or just kind of catch him off guard because he's not looking to put up a fight. He thinks he's around people that love him and respect him because he loves and respects them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds in Daniel's body, most of which were in the back of his head. And then at some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag, and right in the middle of the living room of his house, they doused him in lighter fluid and lit him on fire. It's unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening before he died, but it's very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized his beloved little angel, Sierra, was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the sink, and then they retrieved their circular saw as well as a chainsaw and began attempting to dismember Daniel's body. But they were unable to do it, and so they just kind of set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home with bits of Daniel stuck on the grooves of the saw. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy evidence inside of the house by scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was totally ineffective. And so at that point, the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down, and that would destroy all the evidence. And so around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back, "Oh, he's in the shower, he can't talk to you right now," that was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to burn the house down. But the fire they set was just not very big and it kind of smoldered out. And so they would just kind of leave all of the evidence all over Daniel's house, and they would leave Daniel's destroyed and burned body kind of propped up against the door leading into the garage. And they would just leave the house, hop in Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning, they would leave Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to apprehend Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because the couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and hopped on a bus, and Aaron had not paid the fare. He had just snuck onto the bus. And so at some point, the transit authority had come through the bus and they were asking people to show their tickets, and Aaron didn't have one. And so when they discovered this, they asked for his name, and when they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas PD were actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows why she turned on the one man who would forever love her and would forever support her, what we do know is around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth had gone back to court and they were having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide who was going to have custody over Sierra, Sierra had begun dating Aaron, and she had fallen totally in love with him, and it seemed very much like Aaron had totally fallen in love with her. And somehow Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were planning to run away secretly and go move to Los Angeles. And so when Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife Elizabeth, and then they would go and talk to Aaron's parents, and they would tell them about this plan to run away. And both sets of parents talked and decided it was in both child's best interest if they stopped seeing each other. And so starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their child from seeing each other, and that was it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision, because Sierra was at the time living with Daniel, it seemed like she focused her rage about this decision on Daniel, because he was the one kind of enforcing the rule. And so it's believed in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out, saying that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of this confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves talking about murdering Daniel, they have pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial.
Als de zomer komt, voel ik me vrij. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. We dansen in het licht van de maan. Laat de zomer nooit meer weggaan. De rivier stroomt, het water is zo koel. De kinderen spelen, duiken in het poel. De geur van bloemen, het geluid van de wind. Elke dag een avontuur zoals we het beminnen. Als de zon.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please move in to the room directly above the Like Button's apartment and immediately begin hosting tap dancing classes in your apartment. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast just called Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we upload never before heard stories that are total podcast exclusives on Monday mornings. And on Thursday mornings, we re-upload YouTube audio that has been remastered. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, basically anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and the other channel is called Mr. Ballin en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin that posts near daily content, and we have a Snapchat channel that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merch, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.